Hey, it's Stu, and this is a week in reading review. So let's talk about the books, shall we? I'll go in order that I finished them, more or less. This week I was focusing on, or this last reading week, I was mostly focusing on National Book Award winning authors or books, and also some Kirkus Review finalist authors, and also some of the Latine History Month authors. So the first book I read was this little novella. It was called The Friend by Sigrid Nunez. Nunez. I made a nya for no good reason. Nunez. And I think by now I wouldn't be the first person talking about this little book. It's a much talked about little book, and it is incredibly dense for how little it is. It wasn't even like read in a sitting kind of material. It was a little bit more density, but its central focus is grief and reflection, and sort of the series, the stages of grief. There is a dog involved that certainly serves the purpose of driving a plot, having a character with which to project or share grief with, and also to find material to reflect on for the protagonist in this book. She's incredibly reflective. She's quite a bit philosophical, and she definitely quotes a lot of written works and authors. So if you like books about books, books make a lot of references to other literary works, then this book could also be for you. The writing style is great. The switching of persons as part of the grief cycle, just brilliant. Yeah, I mean, I would have some critical things to say about this book, but why bother? I do have a friend who's bereaved right now, who's also a dog lover, and I think this is the perfect book to give as a gift. I might return to this book in a comparison, just to compare, because there were similar sort of scenarios that happened in this book to another one that I read, Swamplandia by Karen Russell. This book reminds me of, which is this particular marketing says it's a Pulitzer Prize finalist, but Karen Russell had a book on the long list of the current National Book Award, and that's why I pulled this off. I've had it from a little free library for a while, and this book was similar to Trust Exercise by Susan Choi, in that it's a coming of age where the characters are similar age, like 13. No, they're a little older. Well, the characters are in their early teens, 14, maybe 15 in Trust Exercise. And what was really similar to me in both books is like, I couldn't stand the first part of this is why I'm kind of happy that I don't just readily DNF, because it was really hard for me to get into Trust Exercise. And it was, I saw Karen Russell's craft as a writer from the get-go, but it kind of annoyed me that it was first person 13-year-old girl, when 13-year-old girls don't think or write the way that this author was. So that already I was like, I mean, you're going to you make choices to use, for instance, first person, and the inner voice is not similar to how a 13-year-old processes things. I didn't find the sort of appropriation of Native Americanism interesting at all. I found it annoying, as the main character's family has deemed themselves like a tribe, and using Native American regalia and tribal language, meaning like words like chief, when they're not. And I didn't find it amusing. I found it tacky. And a few things like this that I actually it was a struggle for me to get into the book. When I did, though, I enjoyed it. I thought it was a wild ride. I think Karen Russell is an excellent author, and I understand that there's uh, some people are divided around where she takes the story, and of course I can't talk about it that much without spoiling, but I I started to realize how much of a cynic and maybe even sometimes a pessimist when it comes to like how I think books deserve, like if the magic needs to like magically solve problems, or if it's just invented as a it's like coping mechanism, I think, for trauma, especially in these coming of age stories when there's trauma involved. Um yeah, I who would I recommend this book to? I'm not sure. However, I have no regrets in reading this book. It in the end of the day it was definitely worth the read. Oh, after that, I read The Chosen by Chaim Potok. And this book has maybe a total of 3, maybe 4 women characters who very much are just extras. I mean, some of them don't even get names. The ones that do get names, like the Russian nanny, housekeeper, don't get any appreciation at all through the lens of any of the characters or the telling of this author. Then we have, a sister who, if she has a name, I don't recall it. I know that she's often mentioned as just the sister of Daniel, one of the characters. And then we have that, like, maybe the only significant sort of piece of her story is that she's betrothed and has been betrothed from a young age. And then we have another woman who's not even named, who's betrothed to Daniel. And when there's some question about, is this a good situation, it's never discussed in any means, or should he break this promise due to what he wants in his life. It's never even considered the impact on her. Saying all those things would make you think that I despise this book. I did not. I think there was a lot to learn. I think this book was published in 1967, so it is a somewhat contemporary almost to the impacts of World War II, especially on the American Jewish community, and the impacts of the Holocaust on the American and, well, on the international, as it's called in the book, Jewry. I learned a lot of insights about asceticism. There was a lot of beautiful introspection on the relationship between fathers and sons and friendships. And I learned a lot about sort of like the different perspectives being discussed through this book in 1967 in Williamsburg, about Zionism. So for that, it was worth it. That being said, Chaim Potok can go into deep philosophical discussion of nuance on many things, and still couldn't write a female character or pay any homage to the female experience through all of this. And I do criticize that. I think that it could have been done. It didn't need to be done in a way that would distract. And I also think that where this is clearly about incredibly patriarchal society, even in an incredibly patriarchal society, one where contemporary women would certainly assert that the rights of the women are very oppressed, repressed, and suppressed. They still exist, and fathers still consider their daughters and their feelings and love them, and brothers still have relationships with their sisters, etc. So I felt it really felt short in that regard. I think if you're going to read this book, and you should read this book if you don't know, especially if you are really limited in any sort of fictional or otherwise insight into Hasidicism, or Williamsburg, Brooklyn, or those sort of, or even the diversity of American Jewish communities. I think this book, as it's a classic, should be considered a classic just as much as any. Hemingway is not doing anything more insulting than what Hemingway does, for sure. But maybe you would read Schmutz along with it so that you could have female perspective of the same, actually, the Williamsburg Hasidic Jewish community. Sort of why that book was read is because when I hauled it, which was recently, it was a National Book Award finalist. And what kind of saved me from the experience in that book, which, and I mean, in regards to not regarding females as a construct that classic literature does, it's infuriating. I think that's the right word. But I think sort of that rage, disgruntlement, indignation was explored pretty well in Her Body and Other Parties. This is not a book that I liked. I'm not super into horror tropes. I didn't enjoy at all the fan fiction story in this. And there were some stories, like a lot of short story collections, that were much better than others. However, I loved and or needed this book. I needed to revisit and or consider for longer than the time that I had in the text some of the choices that this author made, Carmen Mariana Machado, and the themes that were covered and the way in which they were covered. This is deeply, profoundly, and complexly feministic book. It is a National Book Award finalist, as reported here, but the reason I actually picked this book, which I found in a little free library, was because it was also a Kirkus finalist or shortlist. The book that I read after that was The Leavers by Lisa Ko, and this indeed was the last, with the exception of one that I'm listening to, I need to pull right now. Lisa Ko, the last of my selection for National Book Award winning authors. And this one made the shortlist. This one is autographed. And you know, if you've listened to any of my videos, I really, really, really deeply appreciate the story of the book. In this being signed, I got this at a thrift store, so I did pay $3 or $4, but maybe $4 for this book. And I have some other Lisa Ko that I think I want to read more of in the future. It's on my to-do list. This is 2017. It's like that's the year that most of the books I haul, right, from these thrifting free. Anyway, The Leavers follows the story of a young man, a boy, and his mother. So we start the story from the perspective of the boy, and the boy has recently been returned to the mother from China, and the boy was living with the grandfather, while the mother was able to find some stability and make some money. The grandfather passes, and so the boy comes back to the mother, and we start the story with the mother and the son kind of trying to make it in New York, living with the mother's boyfriend's family, sister. It's the sister. They're living like two families together. And then the mother disappears, and we don't know where, and the boy gets adopted by a white American family in upstate New York, and his life is completely changed, and even up to his name, he's given an anglicized name. And then we follow a lot of narrative and reflection on what's the impact of these sorts of situations where very specifically in this book, a white American suburban family adopts an urban Chinese child. And then, even though they're trying in this book to sort of bridge cultural gaps or understand cultural gaps, um, I think the book clearly shows that, they can't see the water they're swimming in, and they just are not that sophisticated in reflecting on their supremacist mindset, and or they really understand the experiences of this child who, of course, must be going through abandonment issues, and indeed is. And so this book looks at that a little too. It also then switches to the point of view of the mother. And so, like Sing Unburied Sing, this book oscillates between the perspective of the child as the child grows and the perspective of the mother when she's reintroduced into the story. And I really appreciate that. I really appreciate any author's effort to try to look at what the parent's going through at the same time that the child is going through it, and it being impacted by life that a child isn't choosing, and the adult or the parent also is being impacted by life they're not choosing, and everyone is doing their best. Where's the grace? Where's the forgiveness? Where's the reflection? And I think that this book does a decent job of that. I thought that it adopted maybe too many stereotypes of the adoptive parents. And I thought that, for instance, it could have been more complex and even leaned into being more complex, that at the time when they were being critical of their child, they weren't, of course, understanding the biggest picture. And also they were dealing with, someone who was battling addiction and lying and deceiving. And so some of their reactions, if you took the context of the racial differences out, the reactions of the parents, and I mean, can you and can you not? Probably no, you can never take a context out that's pertinent. But also, I thought it leaned too much into stereotypes and didn't get into the complexity of with and without, because of and in spite of these ethnic and racial differences and cultural and national origin differences and language. They're at one point dealing with a child who is floundering, a bit. And the way that they handle it, it's especially in the introduction, is quite stereotypical. I thought probably the most valuable, which is, I don't know if that's exactly what I mean, but that's how I'm going to phrase it. The most valuable insight that this book had is what happened to the mother when she goes through. So this is a bit of a spoiler, but I think that the blurb talks about it. So I guess don't watch my reviews too carefully if you care a lot about spoilers. I don't really dig on highly plot-driven twist book anyway, so I don't know if the reading of this is for the twists in the plot. I think it's more for the introspection, especially of this thing that I'm going to say, which is the mother goes through a deportation process, which is quite traumatic, quite lengthy, in almost to anyone's observation through reading this book, it's inhumane. And what I really appreciated is it didn't say the time and place. It's really easy for us now to sort of suggest that inhumane deportation processes happen under sort of one political party's few years in power or not. And in fact, I'm pretty sure that this story could be happening under, it could have, the ICE detention center could have been under Obama, Biden, Trump, or otherwise Bush, because they exist and they have existed through all of the coming of power of different political parties, and the way in which we treat immigration and who gets to stay and the impact. I mean, she left a child, a toddler, well, just school-aged, actually, child abandoned, and, was detained, incarcerated, for years before her deportation. And I thought that that was maybe one of the most powerful insights of this book, was for her to really discuss what this character goes through in that, and then for you to see the big picture of what this separation meant for both the child and the mother throughout the whole story. After the Leavers, well, yeah, I'll talk about this. I read Margot's Got Money Trouble by Ruthie Thorpe. I have 3 Ruthie Thorpes. This is my first Ruthie Thorpe go. Ruthie Thorpe tends to, from what I can tell in this book and maybe in The Knockout Queen, maybe looks a little bit at celebrity or celebrity close, like they're not quite like whatever those levels are, A-level celebrity, but some kind of celebrity, and how that impacts people. And it is not a theme or a genre that I'm interested in at all. I am interested in exploring sort of the feminine conversation around women's access to make any kind of money to survive, access to autonomy of their body and of their mind, and how they endure, process, survive, and combat the hugely insidious social problem of sexual harassment and sexual assault. And this book, on some levels, tackles all of those, and on some, all of those issues that I just listed. And in some ways, it does a decent job. And in other ways, it doesn't. Like, it postures to be a somewhat feminist book, and then there's a character who, the author, which decides to describe us a little fat. So some sort of like weird fat shamey shit going on that, honestly could have been really real for this character, but this character is made up. I also really would like to problematize the juxtaposition between OnlyFans, and I appreciate Ruthie Thorpe taking on a really contemporary integration of women's bodily autonomy and what's classified as sex work. And I appreciate that some of the introspection with the father, who was a professional wrestler, who was also using his body and exploiting in some ways his body for financial gain and celebrity. I think that she made some interesting and noteworthy comparisons there. I also didn't appreciate how it was constantly, but it's not really sex in OnlyFans, as if sex workers who engage in some form of what is defined as, without any complexity in this book, as sex, also don't have rights to their body, their decisions, and their children. So I didn't like, I'm sensitive towards using the juxtaposition of, it's not that, therefore we're not bad. So what you're actually doing is saying that that's bad, rather than saying none of this is bad. And I think that this book tried a little to say women, men, people should have rights to their bodies and decisions that they make about them. And it's not so easy, particularly for women, because they're criticized and in fact disenfranchised and shunned if they make decisions about being in control. And they do that. They say that thing quite in this book. Ruthie Thorpe says that very explicitly. But these little nuances, like that juxtapositioning and calling another woman fat, there's no reason to use. Like, that did not help us understand who this person was at all. In the story, it wasn't even like the person was a little bit fat and therefore had less OnlyFans so someone could surmise. No, it was just the description of a body, of a character of a woman that didn't need to be there. So there were lots of, that was just an example of some little issues that I had. I don't find Ruthie Thorpe's work incredibly complicated. I found it really base level. Like if you're just at the basic, like, whoa, women have bodies that they can have control of, like base, then this is probably a good place to start. It's makes basic arguments that probably seem quite, divisive for people who don't believe like that's an ethic, right? That's a moral of like, do people have rights to their bodies, or should other people be telling them what they should be doing with their own body? But I found it quite basic. I found that, for instance, this book was so much more complicated and raw and real on about women, their bodies, and other parties. I also want to note that in both of these books, there's an older man professor who is a predator. And where both of these books work on understanding sort of if that's a complex problem or not, I would like to suggest that maybe it's not. Maybe it's quite clear. And maybe if we had clear legal or policies, as many places do, around it, that we wouldn't have to be going through this sort of like ethical ambiguity on, is this considered appropriate, if not immoral, if not illegal, that is happening in these two books, which that's just my aside. Okay, by the River Piedra, I sat down and wept. No, this book sucked. This was a horrible book, and I tried to glean something from it. This book, more or less, is like sort of the same appropriative sort of what's supposed to be mind-blowingly religious, philosophical, metaphysical introspection that's just as appropriative, again, as the Celestine Prophecy. It's coming out about the same time. We're supposed to be discussing like the female face of God, but here we have a male character who uses straight up just romanticized stalker tactics to isolate and get a woman by herself and say, don't worry, I know you don't love me, but I'll wait for you. And then mansplains her the female face of God. Like, this book would have been so much more compelling in any of its like attempt at its very myopic, very one-dimensional explanation of the female face of God if the actually main character were a woman who was out sowing her wild oats as the male character was, and the man character was at home being chaste, and see if he could set up this female character pursuing the way that this male character does, the love interest, without using tropes such as she's a seductress and she's scandalous. That would have been so much more interesting than this woman who, this is supposed to be revolutionary, and here we have this woman who's otherwise got no personality, by the way. There's nothing described to develop this character at all. Zero attributes of her personality, other than she came in a small town, she fell in love with a kid once when she was young, and she's chaste, right? Like, that seems to be an assumed important part of the story. And then this man has to come and like save her from her godlessness by showing her that God is love. And there's a female face of God by pursuing her even when she says she doesn't want to be pursued. This is a male author writing a female as if she doesn't know how to have her own mind. The other is when she doubts herself and uses her knowledge as surviving as a woman. And whenever she leans into that, it's the other, as if it's like the evil voice in her head. And where I do agree that sometimes we develop coping mechanisms to the trauma that we experience as women in this world, being constantly harangued, harassed, and assaulted by being, we do develop coping mechanisms that don't serve us or aren't necessarily great, and it could be considered called the other in our mind. But really, that just sounds like more of this guy not understanding what coercive sexual assault, harassment, or even isolation, like, yuck. This book was so puke, and I'm sorry, Paulo Coelho, no, like, I don't even want to put this book into a little free library. Like maybe someone, ooh, there's a female face of God and they have sex and they're religious. Maybe that who is enough mind blowing for them and they can hold on to it. But for me, this was just plain offensive. That brings me to Isabel Allende, The Infinite Plan. It was kind of interesting to read The Infinite Plan because I'm listening to it about the same time as The Chosen. There were a lot of similar cross-religious themes. I'm going to give this a soft DNF. I'm not enjoying this book. I think there are some parts of this book I really, really enjoy. I like the way that Isabel Allende tells stories. I think that this book probably had more potential period as a book, and not be as offensive as it would have taken some of the effort of this book to develop the backstories and develop the personalities of the characters. Yeah, develop the characters as this. If you wanted to write a little philosophical anecdote, then do that. But through this fictional characterization, no. This one, on the other hand, maybe goes too far into all of the side characters, and I found in listening I got a little lost. One part and where the book again offended me on the similar terms that several of these books have is there's a moment when the sister character is confronted with haranguing, harassing, and assaulting. And her reaction is to, according to the narrative, gain a lot of weight and build a body that doesn't seem to be as subjected to all of the haranguing, harassing, and assaulting. And then Isabel Allende uses another female character to describe this reaction as hatred towards men rather than a reaction of absolute survival or terror, or even a trauma response. And I understand, again, both of these books are from the 1990s. Maybe we've come a long way. Maybe we haven't, because in some ways this book is quite a bit more sophisticated in some of its feminist, ideas and racial ideas, both set in LA as this book, which was published in 2025. But I have a friend who got this book recently in Spanish, likes to read in Spanish. If they want to do a buddy read, then I'll pick this book back up or listen again. But for now, this is centering the story of a cis white male during the sort of he goes to Berkeley, he goes to Vietnam. And I've heard that story through multiple different lenses, multiple different times. I'm not saying that there isn't something that this book has to offer that some other stories didn't. That's probably true. This, by and large, if for no other reason than this is written by Isabel Allende, who is trying to explore, a male experience. I still would like to have stories either more contemporary or of more diverse points of view, even if we're going to, for instance, I can say Ocean Vuong obviously covers the Vietnam War experience in a different way that I can say, yeah, sure, I have lots I can still read about Vietnam as a conflict that the U.S. was involved in. Maybe it doesn't have to be the white male hippie Berkeley soldier one. Maybe there are others, such as Ocean Vuong does. So I have problems with this book. I have things I love about this book, but I'm going to soft DNF it. I think I've had enough of it for now. And kind of what helped me decide that was Exit West by Mohsin Hamid. It's a spectacular book. It is good in so many ways. And the way in which he tells the story of immigrants, the story of war, the story of survival, the story of love. This is, by and large, is a love story. How we use faith and religion, how we use culture and how we develop belonging. He just does so much in this short amount of time. And I think he does it so spectacularly. And I read about half of this and then I had to do other things. And I decided to not continue to listen to this, to start listening to this. And the audio he reads, Mohsin Hamid himself reads. And it's a great listen. And that's what kind of helped me come up with the decision that I don't need to keep listening to this. I can move on, and have indeed. And this was my sort of moving on point. And I started listening to a different book this morning on my commute. So yeah, I can't say enough good things about Exit West. I've been talking now and sitting on my, cross-legged on my floor for a little too long. So I won't say much other than, for sure, of every book here, this is the one that I would recommend the most to the widest reading base. And I think that he does an amazing job addressing many of the same themes that were addressed in all of these other books, and doing it in a way that is clear and complicated yet digestible. And I feel like this is one of those ones like I want to revisit at another time. So I hope it comes back to me, because I am still determined to unhaul all of my books to friends, little free libraries, or friends of the library donation. And in some cases such as this, which I did get from a used from a pre-independent bookstore, I will maybe see if they want it back for some store credit. So there we go. Those are the books that I read this last week, and I will see you for another book review video next week.